Hello students, welcome back to Economics Simplified with Favor. I am Favor Olarewaju, aka God's Favor. Please do me a favor, you're amiable instructor for this class. On this channel, we break down complex economic topics into simple illustration that the average person can relate to. This series of video is on Introduction to Microeconomics as an MICRO, using the textbook by Gregory Mankiw, either the 9th or 10th edition on the principles of microeconomics is fine. And before we get started on today's topic, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you get regular updates. Don't forget to like and to share these videos to other economic students that would benefit from these videos. And quickly, let's move on to chapter 22 on theory of consumer choice. So in this topic, we're going to be looking at the various factors and concepts that affect consumers in terms of the decisions we make in buying and spending on goods and services. So the first major concept that I want to explain is budget constraints. What is budget constraints? So budget constraint just refers to the fact that as consumers, we want to be able to afford all the good things of life, right? We want to be able to buy all the fancy goods and services and enjoy our lives to the fullest, right? But this is very constrained or dependent on our income level. So for instance, if you're only earning $2,000 a month, then there's a limit of how much goods and services you can spend on. And so that is what budget constraints means. It's basically referring to your income constraints, whereby you need to have a limited budget for different expenses. And this reflects in, for instance, if you want to buy shoes, clothes, groceries, and the likes, then you would find yourself having to choose, okay, do I want a Greek yogurt, for instance, or do I want a great value yogurt, right? And you most likely, if you have a limited budget, you most likely would prefer to go for a great value yogurt, right? Or even if you want to buy a car, it's like, okay, do I buy a fairly used car or do I buy a brand new car? If you're a student, you might be better off buying a fairly used car because, you're still learning how to drive or you're still new to driving and you might likely wreck the car soon. So it's a lot of expense, right? That might not be worth it. So that is how income constrains the consumer spending on different goods and services, right? So it's like, even if you want to buy a house, do you want to buy a house in the suburbs or do you want to buy a house in the city, right? And also based on the expenses. Also, when it comes to choices, it's like, do you want to work more hours or do you want to have more leisure time? So if you work more hours, then you'll be able to earn more money that could help you to spend and gain more satisfaction from goods and services. But if you decide to have more leisure hours, then you have less money in your pocket and then you would have to forgo all these goods and services that you would like to buy. So for instance, if you have $3,000 and you want to give yourself a treat, then you have two choices. Do you want to spend it on $10 per a pound of steak, or do you want to spend it on $2 per one avocado? So if you decide to buy only steak, then that means you would be splitting $3,000 divided by $10 per 1 pound of steak, and that means you'll be able to afford 300 pounds of steak. That's a lot of pounds, right? So probably you wouldn't eat that alone. But if you decide on the other hand that you want to spend all your money on avocado, then you would divide $3,000 by $2, and that means you would have as much as 1,500 avocados. Okay, so these are the extremes if you decide to buy only steak or you decide to buy only avocados. And that forms your budget constraint line. I'm going to show that. So let's assume this axis is for avocado. And then let's assume this is your x-axis. And then let's assume your y-axis is for steak. So therefore, if you're buying only steak, the maximum number of steak you can get is 300. And then if you're buying only avocados, the maximum number of avocados you can get is 1,500. So therefore, your budget line would be something like this, where you either buy 300 steak, 1,500 avocados, or anything in between that falls inside this budget line. So you can't buy anything outside of the budget line. Let's decide that instead of buying only steak or avocado, you decide to split your money to buy a little bit of both goods. So then, let's say you decide to spend $2,000 on avocado. Since it's $10 per pound, then that means you would end up buying 200 steak, right? And you're left with $1,000. And let's say you decide to spend that $1,000 on the avocado. So therefore, you will be left with 500 avocados. On the graph, you would have 200 right here. And what you'll be able to buy with this 200 would be equivalent to 500 avocados. So you would be somewhere here, let's say point A on the graph. Okay, so this is what happens if you decide to split your money between steak and avocado. You would be at different points of these budget constraints. If you decide to buy 100 steak, then you would have $2,000 left for avocados, and you'll probably be at 1,000 avocados. So that would be point B, and let's just say this is point C. Okay, so this is how you move along the budget constraints, and you have different combinations of good based on your budget. However, is it possible to buy 200 pounds of steak and 600 avocados? No, because at 200 pounds of steak and 600 avocados, then that is going to be outside of this budget constraint, point D. So this point is not possible because it is outside your budget constraints, okay? So remember, I'm going to call this budget constraint BC. So this line is your budget constraint. Then quickly, how do you calculate the slope of a curve? So this is a straight line curve. And how do you calculate the slope? The slope is simply your change in y over your change in x, or what we call rise divided by 1. So basically, this is saying if you want to get additional avocado, then you have to give up some steak. And if you want to get additional steak, then you have to give up some avocado. So let's put that into practice. So let's say you want to move from point A to point B. So in point A, you have 200 steak and 500 avocado, but you want to go to point B where you have more of avocado. So to get more of avocado, how much steak do you have to give up? You have to give up 100 steak to get more avocado. So your change in your y-axis is simply saying 200 minus 100, right? So you had 200 steak before, now you have 100. So that means you are losing 100 steak. So that would be minus 100 divided by, you had 500 avocados, now you have 1,000. So that's an additional 500 avocado, right? And this change is calculated as new minus old. So therefore, in terms of your steak, your new quantity of steak would be 100 at point B minus your old quantity of 200. So 100 minus 200, and that is going to give you minus 100. And your new quantity of avocado for your x-axis is 1,000 minus your old quantity of avocados, which was 500. So divided by 500. Okay, so this is equal to minus 1 divided by 5, and that is the slope of these budget constraints. So that means you have to give up basically 100 steak to get 500 avocados. So that means your slope is basically 1 over 5. Or 0.2 if you convert that to decimal. So now the slope for one good is equivalent to the inverse of the slope for another good. So this slope is in terms of how much steak you are giving up for avocados. So you give up 100 steak for 500 avocados. That is the inverse of, if you want to look at the slope the other way around. So slope in terms of avocado, ITO means in terms of avocado compared to steak, would be the inverse of this slope we calculated before. So that would simply be, you have to give up 500 avocados in order to get 100 steak. So that would be 5. Okay, so the slope of one good in terms of the other is equal to the inverse of the slope of another good. So now how about if your income reduces to $2,000? Then this is what we call the income effect. And this basically means that because your income has changed, then your total combination of goods and services that you buy would change altogether. So now income has reduced. What that tells you is that you are going to buy both less avocado and less steak. And let's see if that is true. So now you have $2,000 instead of $3,000, right? And at $3,000 in the previous graph, on the previous slide, we saw that we could combine 200 pounds of steak and 500 avocados. But now with $2,000, you can no longer afford this combination because remember your steak is $10 per pound. So if you're still going to combine 200 steak, then that means you definitely can't even afford any more avocado, right? So therefore, what that tells you is that your budget constraint is going to totally shift. It's going to change, right? So now you're going to have a new budget constraint that starts at $200, right? So remember your extremes. So if you're buying only steak, then that means at $10 per pound, you can only afford 200 steak only. Okay, and if you're buying only avocado, then that means at $2,000. So let's assume the price of avocado is still the same, $2 per avocado. Then that means you can only afford 1,000 avocados. So you're going to have a totally new budget constraint that starts at 200 steak or 1,000 avocados. So we're going to move from BC1 to BC2. So therefore, you see your income effect. Reduction in income leads to a reduction in your steak and a reduction in your avocado. So shifts in budget constraints to the left. So therefore, you probably find yourself being able to consume a combination of, let's say, 100 steak, which would be $1,000. So you're left with $1,000 for avocado, and that would probably give you 500 avocados. So you probably have a combination that is 100 steak and 500 avocado, or anything in between this new budget constraint. I'm going to give it a different color if that helps. How about if the price for avocado instead increases from $2 to $4, right? So that means it doubles in price. What does that mean for your budget constraints? Well, it's going to affect your budget constraint differently whereby before you could combine either 300 pounds of steak or 1,500 avocados. But now, because the price of avocado is higher, you're going to reduce your demand for avocado. But most likely, your demand for steak is going to remain the same because the price of steak is still the same. Okay, so you would then reduce your demand for avocado, and even possibly you might end up buying more steak. But the main thing that's going to change is your demand for avocado is going to reduce according to the law of demand. So now, assuming you only wanted to buy avocados, and remember the initial income was $3,000. So $3,000 divided by $4 means that you're only able to afford 750 avocados only. So can you see how your demand for avocado is literally going to drop by half, right? Now you can no longer afford 1,500 avocados, you can only afford 750. So your budget constraint is going to rotate inwards like this, whereby you still have a new budget constraint line, but it just rotates this way. So this was your BC1, and this is your BC2. And this is called the substitution effect, whereby you will now probably buy less avocado and more steak, because now avocado is twice as expensive as before. Something else that is worth noting is that either your income effect or your price effect or substitution effect can dominate, right? So if your substitution effect dominates in this scenario, then that means you would end up buying less avocado and more steak. But if your income effect dominates, then that means you will end up buying less of both goods for a lower income level, or you buy more of both goods if your income increases. Now that brings us to a concept called normal goods. So normal goods are goods in which when your income increases, you buy more of the good, or when your income reduces, then you buy less of the good. That's just rationality, right? If you have more income, you spend more. If you have less income, you spend less. That is for a normal good. And these are regular goods and services, groceries, clothes, shoes. However, inferior goods are the ones that go in the opposite direction. So for inferior goods, if you have less income, you spend more on those goods. So as the name implies, inferior means that things that you are more likely to consume when you are broke, right? So ramen noodles, potatoes, burgers, fries, all those, cheap, affordable goods and services, so that when you have less income, you buy more of those goods and services to be able to sustain yourself. And then, of course, for inferior goods, when you have more money, you would not want to buy those goods because, hey, you have more money, you can go to fancy restaurants. So you no longer want to eat like your regular burgers or, potatoes or ramen noodles and those poor goods, so to say. So inferior goods go in the opposite direction. For more income, you buy less quantity of those goods. And for less income, you buy more of those goods when it comes to inferior goods. Another similar concept is given goods. So this simply means that when the price of a good increases, then you end up buying more of that good. And that is because your income is less. So that applies to an inferior good that doesn't have close substitutes, where because you have less income, even though the price of that good has increased, but because it's still relatively cheap compared to your regular goods, then you're still going to buy more of that good and service, right? So the examples of given goods still are the examples of inferior goods. Now, this brings us to the next concept, which is called indifference curves. I call this IC for short, but basically this means the indifference curve is based on the satisfaction level that you derive as a consumer. So we've talked about budget constraint that is due to limited income. Now, indifference curve is just based on the satisfaction of a consumer, and that refers to the various combination of goods and services that would equally make a consumer happy. By equally, I mean like in the last example, either you combine 200 pounds of steak and 500 avocados to make a consumer happy, or the consumer consumes 100 pounds of steak and 1,000 avocados to make the consumer equally happy. So that is what I mean by different combination of goods and services. So basically, if we have our indifference curve, remember your avocados are here and you have your steak here. So while your budget constraint is most likely going to be a straight linear curve that slopes downwards like your demand curve, your indifference curve is going to be more of a curve that goes like this, right? So indifference curves are going to be many, right? I'm going to call this IC1, IC2, and IC3. The higher any difference curve is, the higher the satisfaction that the consumer derives because they're able to consume more goods and services. But again, remember that consumers, we prefer more to less. We like to consume more of a good as opposed to having less of a good, right? But again, remember that is dependent or constrained by your income, right? Or your budget. So the indifference curve is based on the marginal rate of substitution, MRS, and that refers to the slope of your indifference curve. This indifference curve has a slope, right? Remember, we calculated your slope as the change of y divided by the change of x, right? So that means how much of a good are you willing to give up to get more of another good, right here? So remember in the previous example, when the consumer had $3,000, they were willing to give up 100 steak to get 500 more avocados, right? So that was the rate of substitution, and that was the slope. of the indifference curve. So let's assume at indifference curve 2, you have point A and point B. And let's take point A as the point where the consumer had 200 steak and they were able to consume 500 avocados, versus point B, where the consumer has 100 steak and they're able to consume 1,000 avocados. So in this indifference curve, we would say that the consumer is indifferent between point A and B. But at point C, let's assume point C is on the highest indifference curve. At any point on point C, whether it's point C, point D, point E, the consumer can afford higher combinations of steak and avocados. But the question is, can the consumer afford this? The first property of an indifference curve is that it slopes downwards because of your marginal rate of substitution. So remember, if you want to get more of avocado, then you have to give up more of steak, right? So that makes the indifference curve to slope downwards. Another property of indifference curve is that it does not cross. So you cannot have an indifference curve where you have point A like this, and then you have point B crossing point A. Because at this point of intersection, that means the consumer is indifferent. And why is that? At the indifference curve B, it starts off being a higher indifference curve, right? Higher than indifference curve A. But at this point of intersection, that means the commodities on indifference curve B are no longer preferred to what is on indifference curve A. Because now, at this point, the satisfaction derived by the consumer is the same. And that contradicts the basic assumption of indifference curve that more is preferred to less. Because if the consumer is deriving equal satisfaction from two indifference curves that are intersecting, then that means there's no higher satisfaction from having a higher indifference curve, right? So that is very contradictory. So it's not possible to have an indifference curve that intersects, right? More must always be preferred to less. As you see, point C, D, E would always prefer to point A and B. Another key property is that indifference curve is bowed inward. It's not outward like this. And this is a no. The same way intersecting indifference curve is a no. And the fact that your indifference curve is bowed inward means that there is trade-off, meaning that based on the marginal rate of substitution, MRS, so you have to give up some good to get more of another good. Now, what are the types of indifference curve? The first type of indifference curve is known as the straight line indifference curve. So you see how your indifference curve here is literally a curve that is bowed inward. It could also be a straight line that looks like your demand curve or your budget constraints. But why is this the case? That is for the case of perfect substitute. So perfect substitute means that you either consume one good or the other good. So for instance, when you say, if you want to choose between hamburger or hot dogs, you can't consume both of them at the same time, so you consume one or the other. So let's assume good X is for hamburger and then good Y is for hot dogs. So then you can choose to consume one extreme of hot dog or one extreme of hamburger. And what that implies is that your marginal rate of substitution is equal. That is what they call the constant MRS. So that means you are giving up equal units of hot dogs, good Y, to be able to consume extra units of hamburger, right? For instance, if you give up one hamburger, then you're able to consume one extra hot dog. Or if you give up two hot dogs, then you're able to consume two extra hamburgers. So what you are giving up, your opportunity cost or your slope is exactly the same for both goods. Now, another type of indifference curve is the right angle indifference curve. This is a case for perfect complement. So perfect complements are things that you consume together. So for instance, when you talk about pen and paper, so as you increase your demand for pen, you also have to increase your demand for paper because you need paper to be able to write on. So another good example is shoe and socks, right? So you're increasing your demand for shoe, then you're also going to have to increase your demand for socks. You have to buy both goods together. So it's not like perfect substitutes where you're choosing one or the other. Here you have to consume both goods. So that is why your indifference curve would be like a right angle here. So for instance, if you want to consume 10 quantity of shoes, then you would also have to consume 10 quantity of socks. So let's say X is for socks and Y is for shoes, right? So therefore, you would meet somewhere here. So the same thing, if you want to reduce your quantity, then let's say 5 pairs of shoes, then you also need 5 pairs of socks, right? So then it will come down like this. So this will be point A and this will be point B. So this is how the right angle indifference curve works. So this leads us to the next concept called optimization. And what does optimization mean? It simply means to make the most of your resources. So as a consumer, what we care about is to maximize our utility. When you talk about utility, that means satisfaction. So to maximize our satisfaction, and that is measured by the indifference curve, your IC, and at the same time, minimize cost, as in your budget constraints. And what that tells you is to be able to maximize your satisfaction and minimize your cost at the same time, then you need to get to a point where your marginal rate of substitution for your indifference curve is equal to the slope of your budget constraints. And what does that mean? So remember how in your graph, where we had our avocado on the x-axis and we had our steak on the y-axis, then you have different indifference curves, your IC1, you have a higher indifference curve, IC2, and you have another indifference curve IC3, right? So remember, more is preferred to less. So the consumer ordinarily will prefer this indifference curve 3, that is the highest point of satisfaction, but is it affordable? Can the consumer afford that price, right? So that is determined by your budget constraint. So that simply means the optimization point would be where your budget constraint intersects your indifference curve. And imagine that most likely your budget constraints cannot reach indifference curve 3. So let's imagine you have a budget constraint that intersects your indifference curve at this point. And this is the point of intersection. So that means, hypothetically, let's assume that this is for 200 steak and then 500 avocado. So based on where the indifference curve of the consumer can reach, the consumer has no other choice than to stay on indifference curve 2, right? And possibly combine this exact combination of goods and services. So that is how the optimization point is reached for a consumer to maximize satisfaction and minimize cost at this intersection points. And your demand curve simply reflects the decisions that we consumers make. So your demand curve is simply going to tell you, okay, so how many goods and services or how many quantity of avocado and steak did this consumer actually buy? So your demand curve is simply a reflection of the choices that the consumer makes based on your MRS and your budget constraints. So basically, if your marginal rate of substitution, your MRS, exceeds your wage, then that means the consumer values leisure more than working. And that's probably because the wage is low, right? So therefore, the consumer is better off enjoying themselves with leisure activities. However, if your wage is greater than your marginal rate of substitution, then that means the consumer will prefer to work. So then work will be preferred to leisure. And that tells you that if your wage is higher, then your opportunity costs would be leisure. So meaning that leisure will be more costly when wage is higher, because that means you have to give up a higher amount of wage to be able to have more leisure. So higher wage means greater opportunity cost of leisure. And that leads to the substitution effects, whereby the consumer now substitutes leisure for more work. So because the wage is higher, then the consumer has more incentive to give up leisure so that they can work more hours. And when they work more hours, they're able to make more money and produce goods and services so that they can be able to afford the goods and services that they desire to buy. However, when the income effect dominates, then that means that higher wage would lead to increased leisure. So instead of the worker to work more hours because of higher wage, then higher wage would make them to spend less work hours and have more leisure time. And usually that is for a case, maybe if the wage is like really low, like minimum wage, then they might not really want to work extra hours, as opposed to if the wage is like really high already and then they increase the wage. So how about interest rate? Interest rate is simply the relative price of current consumption in terms of future consumption. So what that tells you is that interest rate measures the trade-off between present and future consumption. So if you're talking about the substitution effect, then that would mean if you want to consume more now, then that means you would probably have less to consume in the future, right? So consuming more now is reflective of an impatient person that just wants to enjoy their life at the fullest while, they're young, as opposed to, saving and sacrificing and working hard to enjoy later in the future. So that would be the substitution effect when it comes to interest rates. And usually for such impatient people that want to maximize their present consumption at the expense of their future consumption, then they would have a higher interest rate. So because they're so impatient, they don't want to wait for delayed gratification, then it will cost them more, right? So their interest rates would be higher. So you would see such people going to the bank to incur loans and everything. So you see that the cost of borrowing would be higher for them, as opposed to someone who is like more willing to save and spread it out over a longer period of time. Now, this is different from the income effects, whereby in the income effect, let's say you have an increased income, then you are able to both increase your present and your future consumption. And because you're increasing consumption, then you're reducing savings. Or if you have less income, then you reduce your present and your future consumption so that you have more savings. So for your interest rate, your optimal point would be the point where your MRS is equal to your interest rates. And that is because your interest rate, as we defined, is the relative price of current consumption in terms of future consumption. So your MRS, the point where your MRS intersects with your interest rate, would be your optimal consumption in the interest rate of financial markets. And that is that for chapter 22. So this is the end of this series of Introduction to Microeconomics. I hope you have learned a lot, as I've enjoyed teaching this class so far. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Like and share to your friends who might find these videos helpful, and see you in subsequent videos.